So, my name is Sami. I'm a research analyst with Masari. I spent most of my time focusing on DePIN. However, recently I've been spending a lot of time at the intersection of crypto and AI. This journey started for me about 9 months ago with ChatGPT, and fast forward to today, I think it's become abundantly clear how a lot of the mindshare, human capital, and VC money that was initially directed to crypto has been redirected or pivoted to AI. And it's not really surprising, AI is now the latest and greatest technology. However, there's this misconception that only one of these technologies can win out. Just because AI might be the next platform doesn't mean that crypto is no longer relevant. I think they can both succeed, and I personally believe that they're complementary technologies, and I'm sure the panelists up here agree as well. So with me, I have three amazing founders that are building at this intersection of crypto and AI. So I'd love you guys to kind of introduce yourselves and just give us a brief background about your project. We'll start with you, Saneel.
Hey guys, I'm Saneel. I'm one of the co-founders at Origin. We're trying to build a network of nodes where they can collaboratively share and host AI models, and we bake in a bunch of primitives around that to make collaboratively hosting models possible, and also bake in a proof layer so that the network inference is trustless.
Hey guys, my name is Michael. I'm the co-founder of Robots. So we're building this open world game with real life Cyborg robots. And the idea is, think of it almost like Mario Kart, but in real life. So we expect gamers to actually start playing for the paying and actually spending time to play this game. But a byproduct of these gamers playing the game is actually the data that's collected. So the video and also what the gamer is doing with the controller. We think that that data set is actually a very valuable data set for training that is used for to achieve level 5 autonomy on the cyber environment.
Hey, I'm Ben, one of the co-founders of Jensen. Jensen is a machine learning compute protocol. Essentially, we connect up all of the machine learning capable compute hardware in the world, so GPUs, TPUs, CPUs, anything that's capable of doing machine learning training work, and allow it to be used by machine learning engineers instead of using a resource like AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure or something like that. And essentially, by doing this in a completely decentralized way, we create a fair market over that resource instead of the current situation where there's an oligopoly over that compute resource and the prices are very, very large. So Jensen provides kind of two main benefits. It's a much lower price. Because it's a fair market, we drive down that price significantly because there's a lot of latent supply in the world that can be used but currently has no distribution channel. We also increase the scale that people can access. So right now there's lots of chip shortages. We hear loads of things about people wanting to get access to NVIDIA A100s and H100s and things like that. There's loads more devices in the world that are capable of training models that just you can't connect up to them as an engineer. So we provide a network where you can access theoretically absolutely every device in the world up to kind of infinite scale, depending on how many devices there are in the world.
Awesome. So for this first question, I want to give a little background. So about a month ago, there was a study that was released that showed the performance of GPT-4 had actually decreased over time from when it was initially released, and this really showed the general public, the lack of transparency that was within these centralized AI systems. Fast forward a few weeks, there was a memo that was leaked from within Google that basically was them admitting that open source AI was outcompeting them. And it was a losing strategy to actually attempt for any centralized company to attempt to compete with them. So the question I want to pose to you guys is, how does crypto and maybe your project in particular, how can it contribute and help drive the open source AI movement? I'll start with you, Saneel.
Awesome. Yeah, actually I think this is a really great question because fundamentally when I look at Bitcoin or Ethereum or name your blockchain, they've done a lot of things right, they've done a lot of things wrong, but one of the things that they've done right more than anything else is found a way to construct incentives for A, open source software in a way that hasn't been done before, and B, the compute necessary to run that software. I mean, essentially Ethereum is the world computer. And I don't think, and to your point earlier about crypto and AI being synonymous, I think this is exactly the direction that open source AI should go in terms of when you have network-like structures with baked-in incentives, you make the barrier for researchers and builders to access incentives much lower, right? So currently, if you have a novel model, like let's say you either create a new foundational model or you fine-tune an existing one, your ability to monetize and build incentives revolves around your ability to go start a company around it, right? Get the GPUs to host that model. And that is not great, especially in the open source context. So while we have seen a lot of great open source models at companies like Llama and Meta, right? We can't rely on the goodwill of like Meta to keep giving us like Llama 2 or the next great thing. And so what we're trying to do with Origin and I guess similar to Jensen and others is when we think about sharing models and collaboratively hosting, the idea is that if you have a model, you should be able to bring it to the network, right? Let's say you have the compute, you should be able to host a node and people should be able to service requests. You should be able to service requests to the networks. Let's say you don't have the compute, someone else may, right? And they should be able to access your model, host it for you, and you should be able to get royalties. And I think that a lot of that is possible with a lot of the structures we've seen with on-chain incentives and provenance. And so I really do think like a network style structure with incentives that we've seen in blockchain leads itself particularly well to being able to host and distribute open source models, because right now there aren't really incentives for open source models. You know, Hugging Face is great, but they don't actually make a lot of money and they're not great for their creators. And so being able to wrap those necessarily into the infrastructure that's hosted, those incentives is important. Crypto does exactly that, right? So.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. I think we've seen in the AI space in general, like a kind of scramble to figure out what the real value is behind the models, essentially. And there's been various assumptions through time, like what the value is, whether it kind of about 10 years ago, it was assumed that it was in the design of the model itself, and that if you just got a lot of PhDs together and started a startup, that would be kind of a valuable thing to do. That didn't really play out because open source models essentially get that kind of thinking out really quickly. The next assumption was that it would be within the data and that you would kind of build a proprietary data set. That would be the thing that you could then build models that nobody else could build, and the kind of data is the new oil principle would mean that you were a valuable company. That didn't really play out either, and I think the newest assumption is back to the models themselves, that you can build these absolutely enormous models that nobody else can build. I think what Meta have realized quite clearly is that, like we said, you can't beat open source. Those models are going to get out there. They can be distilled really easily. You're not going to kind of hold that advantage for very long. And the larger organizations doing AI, like OpenAI and Anthropic, they're kind of the only value proposition they're left with is the fact that they have the compute to actually build these models and nobody else can. But that's a kind of like dying value proposition, right? It's essentially rent seeking on top of a core resource. And as you said, the beauty of decentralization and these incentive mechanisms is that we can distribute access to core resources like that much more efficiently. And that's what Jensen's about, right? Like we want to distribute access to compute, which we see as essentially a commodity resource like electricity, and having these sort of large companies sit on top of that and rent seek on top of it just holds us all back, basically. Whereas if you think in the Industrial Revolution, if we'd essentially, instead of having electricity into like every home, if we'd kind of put blocks on that and it had only gone to a few really massive companies, we probably would have progressed much slower. But instead, we have it kind of available to lots of people. We want to do the same for compute, and I think there's other core resources underneath models that you can do the same for. The data itself, that's been talked about for a while. The expert knowledge, that happens through academic publishing, but it could be incentivized in a proper attribution way, and we'd like to see that happen with collaboration. So we can do compute, and we'd love people to do the other things as well.
Yeah, definitely second what Ben just said. I do think that the compute do need to come together with the data. So I think it's quite illustrative if you look at how Meta open sourced their Llama 2, right? So they open sourced the model weights, but they didn't open source the data. And the way I look at it is actually perhaps a lot of the secret sauce is how they curate that data set. And so while these gentlemen are all like pushing for all this decentralized compute, like at least for what we're doing with robots, we do think that robotic data set is actually a very valuable and extremely hard to get type of data set. And obviously Tesla as it's a centralized entity has a huge robotic data set and that they've gathered on the road. So if robots were to take off, then potentially this is going to be a crowdsourced effort, and hopefully that data is a bit more decentralized than it would otherwise would have been.
Cool. So you guys are obviously, interacting a lot with some AI, machine learning researchers and engineers, within academia as well as big tech. One thing I've been curious about is like when you guys are having these conversations, how they're reacting, how they're viewing these projects. And Ben, I want to pose this question to you first. I know you guys, raised a pretty massive Series A, and some of that capital you guys are putting towards onboarding some engineers from firms like NVIDIA and Intel. And so I'm curious, where have you found top talent of engineers who are capable to kind of maneuver between crypto and AI, and how do you convince them to join Jensen?
That's a very good question. It's very difficult. I think in the ML space in general, there's quite a large sort of rejection of crypto principles. There's just generally a lot of skepticism that you have to push through. I think what we've found is essentially you can find the people that are just generally curious about technology and can avoid sort of thinking too deeply about all the sort of more financial sides of the space that we've seen sort of go through the boom and bust cycles. When you get somebody actually sort of fundamentally talking about what is decentralization, what is the kind of like trust trade-off that we can change with decentralization, they get quite interested. You talk about consensus mechanisms and things, and how essentially we go straight down to verification, which is the big sort of secret sauce of Jensen. If you have a completely untrusted GPU somewhere else in the world and you want to run a task on that GPU, you have to have some way of knowing that that task is done correctly. And I think a lot of machine learning engineers do understand that. It's a relatively kind of like simple use case to understand, and then when you explain there actually is a solution to that doesn't require a trusted third party, that gets people pretty excited. But you have to stay at the technical level, I think. There's also, in general, I think a lot of the people, unfortunately, a lot of the people that are able to build these very large models are at very large organizations, and there's definitely a kind of cultural difference between a crypto company and specifically also a startup to somewhere like NVIDIA. Like the structures are just completely different, and I think it'd be quite easy to hire the wrong people with the wrong sort of cultural values from those large organizations. So we're very, very careful to make sure that people do kind of truly believe the kind of decentralization culture, even if they've got to it via the kind of like technical route.
And then, Michael, if you could just quickly chime in on this. So I know you've been in contact with some leading AI research groups. Are they reacting positively?
Yeah, I think in our case, because we're dealing with robotic data sets, and frankly, in the robotic data set world, it's the data is very, very hard to come by. So just to give you an idea, the biggest open source robotic data set that's got to do with robotic navigation, it's open sourced by Waymo, and I think they've open sourced around 500 plus hours worth of driving data. We're about to open source our first 1,000 hours. So when we do that in the next couple of weeks, it will be probably the biggest already. And so, but still, when we started reaching out to some of these researchers, the feedback was way more positive than I imagined. So I guess I can say in this room, we're probably going to do quite a lot of things with DeepMind. But yesterday when I met them for, I think, the 4th or 5th time, I finally told them about this DePIN thing that we hope to grow. Like, that's how we're going to scale. And they basically look at me completely blank, like, why are you bringing up crypto into this thing? But I just told them, like, to me, this is the only way to grow. Like, if you want way more than 1,000 hours, if you want 1 billion hours, like, this is the only way to do it. They are very skeptical, but, they will use the data for sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, so let's continue there. So if Protobots is successful at generating this massive data set, I think there's a few options that's available to the community, right? They can either just sell the entire data set to a centralized robotics company or AI company like OpenAI. You guys can either build your own like full stack AI application where you guys are like a sidewalk delivery company, or you could even just sell it via some of these decentralized marketplaces. How are you thinking about these options? What do you think might be the best approach?
Yeah, I think the main thing here is the technical limitations. So the kind of data set, whether it's robotic or like, let's say a big LLM model, it seems to me that these data, it's not really fungible, like you can't sell them piecemeal. It's not like, let's say, the Hive-Mapper project, right? If there's a logistics company in Singapore, you probably just buy the Singapore data, that's fine. In our case, like, you really need a huge data set in order for all this transformer model to get all these, they call it emergent capabilities. They only come about when the data set go beyond certain threshold. So it's very hard to sell them piece by piece. You kind of have to train the whole thing. So that has a lot of implications perhaps down the road when we are finally going to do our token, like how to do this properly. Because the fact is that each data cannot be doesn't make sense to sell piecemeal. So right now, my thinking is given the technical constraint, I think either a huge OpenAI of the world acquire this whole data set, buy from the community, or we're going to spend more money and build our own autopilot and wrap a model behind it and then sell the API access, which is basically what OpenAI does, right? So that's a lot easier to manage, but the data is very hard to monetize directly, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to move the conversation a little bit towards decentralized compute marketplaces, Airbnb for GPUs. There was a popular article recently from Semi-Analysis. They were basically talking about the GPU rich versus the GPU poor. The GPU rich include these centralized organizations like Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, so on, versus the GPU poors like Together, Hugging Face, and presumably crypto as well. The argument that they're making is a lot of the top talent in the industry is obviously motivated to go to these GPU-rich organizations just because they can access thousands of top-tier GPUs, whereas some of the engineers at GPU-poor companies are spending a lot of their time on optimizations, which might not matter. And so this is kind of similar to the initial question I asked. So I'll pose this question to you first, Saneel. Building an open source crypto project, how would you argue that a lot of the top talent is going to these GPU-rich companies? And how would you respond?
So when you say top talent, I'm going to assume that you mean a lot of ML researchers that want to work on new foundational models. And I want to make one thing clear, at least in my opinion. Most use cases in the real world are never going to touch the upper bounds of perplexity that even GPT-4 ultimately unlocks. GPT-4 is far more complicated or far more capable than what you would need for most real-world use cases. And overwhelmingly, we're seeing a huge explosion of fine-tuned open source models over smaller, more accessible models for tasks like domain-specific usage, right? And so I really think that when you frame it in the way of top talent going to these GPU-rich companies, sure, these ML researchers will go to companies where the burden of actually experimenting and researching is lowest if they are aiming for one-stop API. But I think when you frame it from the perspective of what do people actually need, you can get most things done that you would need for your daily life or even for a business-focused task with either Llama with their team V or a fine-tuned version, right? And you can have that running on your laptop. And so I think, yes, on one hand, these top-level researchers will go to OpenAI and Anthropic, and people can pay them and for these GPUs. I also do believe that eventually GPU distribution will become a little bit more equitable. I do believe that NVIDIA will ramp up production and we'll start seeing some more CUDA-like support for AMD chips. But that being said, I think if you already go on Hugging Face, you already look at GitHub, you already go see at what people are experimenting with. People are already doing a phenomenal job of taking existing models and purposing them for specific tasks, and people are using them, right? You go to a lot of even if you want to go away from LLMs, you want to go to Stable Diffusion, obviously Stability already uses open source AI models. You go to a lot of these applications that let you go and play with different image generation models, and it's very plug and play. And yeah, to that extent, I don't think that just because a company is GPU rich, that means that the innovation will centralize around them. I think if we look at where the needs are, that's just very much not the case. And I think part of what we're building is to accelerate that behavior by making the barrier to access and the incentives for creating more fine-tuned model, accessing those models and providing the compute very, very upfront. And that's a very, very important thing of what we do at Origin.
You want to just quickly chime in? I'm going to ask one more question afterwards because we're a little short on time.
Yeah, just super quick. I think on this point, I think it depends how we classify top talent, right? We've got a lot of people building very, very similar models at these big companies. Everyone's building, if you kind of picture the space of total kind of models that we could build, everyone's building in the same direction and trying to essentially achieve the same thing, which is just eking out scale of these same transformer models You increase the size of the data center, you add another 1,000 GPUs, and you see if you can make the model slightly bigger. I think what we see is that kind of approach is starting to slow down. The gains that you get from that aren't really as big as they once were, essentially. And at some point, that kind of becomes more expensive than it is worthwhile exploring. With Jensen, we essentially think that rather than going through that path of building these identical models and making them slightly larger with hyper-connected GPUs, what happens if we make an enormous infrastructure of GPUs? We kind of lean into the scaling hypothesis and say, instead of 4,000 GPUs for this model, what happens if we put 1 million GPUs behind it or something like that? Like, yeah, there's different constraints, but the innovation comes out of constraints, right? Like, people try to build new, completely, entirely new model architectures with those constraints, and we see what actual scale we can get, versus all of the talent kind of going into these larger organizations and just building the same models but slightly larger over and over again.
Great. So last question for you, Michael. You briefly talked about from your discussions with some of these research groups that when you bring up that you landed on the DePIN model, they're kind of surprised. So I know you iterated through, you were thinking about how you can crowdsource this data set. You thought, okay, we can potentially do a Kickstarter campaign, a Helium-style DePIN model, or even build out this full-stack sidewalk delivery company, and you landed on DePIN, or crypto, or basically like using a robotic gaming kind of setting. So if you want to just quickly talk about that, and then how about the game a little bit. What we can do is we can show. We have a video as well that we can show about the game. If you want to play that right now, Sal, we can do that.
By the way, if you guys want to actually try controlling one of these, literally play the game, we have a bot. I think in China, you can literally go to the booth and try to play and control the bot after this. So we actually well, this is not the video. Oh yeah, this is the video. So yeah, it's kind of a teaser. So we got quite lucky. I think last week we got viral on TikTok. So I think almost 6 million views now. And from that video, we got a lot of actually paid signups. So we literally have gamers paying like $100 to play this game. Up to $100. Most of them pay $5 to $10. And so yeah, anyway, you try yourself for yourself. Frankly, we stumbled onto this use case randomly. Just like all other cyber robot projects, they all try to do delivery in real life. And what I realized is that perhaps the success rate is still not 100%, right? It's still maybe 80 to 90%. And we realized if that's only 80 or 90%, then it's really hard to get consumers to actually use your robot to basically get delivery. But then we also realized that all the core team members all were fighting each other to play, basically control the bot. And that's when we realized it's actually quite fun to drive the bot. It's weird, but because there's a speaker and microphone as well. You can drive around and then talk to people around the bot. It's weird, but it's fun, yeah. And I think the fact that we went viral on TikTok a couple of times now, I think it says something about it. So hopefully, it's still very, very early days to be frank. But I do think that really to scale this out, you really need something like what Helium and what I think everyone in this room is so excited about. Because the centralized approach to being has shown to fail. So Amazon actually has a big program. They shut it down last year. At one point, I think there are 400 or 500 people working on the cyber robot projects. So it seems to me, the only way, however unlikely, for this to scale is actually just a decentralized route. So we intend to sell the robot at $500. You can see the robot later. It will drive around. My teammate in Philippines will be driving around. So yeah, you can ask me more, I guess. Yeah, and then we start to have some traction and some revenue as well. Just last week.
Yeah. So fun, Michael. If you guys got questions. But thank you for just being amazing, and yeah, thanks guys.